Hello, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to talk about sequential art. So, I'm just going to ask you questions like you're here because I just don't know what else to do. Because why would I just tell you everything? That's not as fun. So just answer me. Pretend like we're actually together and doing the same thing together. So, what makes sequential art different from any other kind of art? It happens in a sequence. That's why we call it sequential. And usually that sequence allows us to tell a story. So it's narrative. It's really special. And throughout this presentation, I'm probably just going to inundate you with Kelvin and Hobbes because it's the best. And there's so many art jokes and they're magic. And if you aren't aware, then 100% always read Kelvin and Hobbes because it's so prescient and so, awesome for artists. It's so good. I loved it as a kid because, they were like dinosaurs and rocket ships and it was really special. But now I love it as an adult because it's so academic. It's great. Okay, back to sequential art. Let's talk. Sequential art could be comics. It could be graphic novels. It could be, just any kind of narrative progression using visual imagery. But let's focus on comics a little bit. So, what characteristics would make a comic worth reading? For you, you might have different opinions than me, but in my opinion, I would say complex scenes, so changing the point of view that we're looking at makes things a little more dynamic. Things like dramatic angles and foreshortening. I think it's interesting when there's a strong understanding of linear perspective, but not only visually, we need to have like a good story too. So are the characters compelling? Are the layouts dynamic but still clear enough that you can read them? Is the storyline interesting? So there's lots of things to consider when we talk about sequential art. So, here's some more Kelvin and Hobbes because always, this is my life, I think. I'll just let you read that for a minute. Yep. As my artist statement explains, my work is utterly incomprehensible and is therefore full of deep significance. It's true, right? So I'm breaking up this lecture kind of into different chunks. So we're going to talk a little bit about style, because art isn't about ideas, it's about style. It's so postmodern, right? I love it. Okay. I know, there's just so much more. Snowmen. You can pause this video and read this. It's so good. Your oeuvre is monochromatic. I love it. Okay, let's actually talk about art now. So, Will Eisner, pretty much the grandfather of comics. He's probably one of the most influential comic book artists throughout our history. His work in the 1940s really opened up a lot of new avenues for the medium, such as incorporating like more cartoony and less realistic styles. And he also broke the tradition of competing image and text by making the text more of a part of the panel's composition, which would make for oftentimes a more aesthetically pleasing page. And one of Eisner's most lasting contributions was his work with the spirit. And we can see this exemplified in the architectural renderings of the comic's title that we see in these images here. I really love this. This was called logotexture, or just wait for this, architecture. Oh, so good. Yeah, so his architecture in his splash pages were very well known. But his strong understanding of linear perspective really brings his cities and his lettering to life. Like, you could even notice how he includes the panels inside of the depth of the lettering on the black and white image, which is really cool. So basically, The Spirit became a veritable textbook for creating comics in America, and Eisner's style was replicated or referenced in most sequential art created after the 1940s. So he was kind of a big deal. Now we're going to move to contemporary times. So J.H. Williams, he's most known for his distinctive splash pages. So very dynamic, lots of energy in his mark making. We see that the panels are not square. They are definitely a lot more organic and full of energy. So his layouts are really unconventional, and regardless of the medium that he's working in, they tend to be quite eye-catching. So whether it's monochromatic or whether it's fully colored, they'll grab your attention. So we'll look at a couple other pages of his work throughout this image, or throughout this lecture. Yeah. Frank Quitely is another guy who's kind of breaking the norm here. So if we look at this splash page, it creates an almost flip book sort of style, which seems to create the appearance of slow motion in the action as the characters are breaking free of the flattened panels. Dave McKean is a favorite of mine, and I think what makes him so interesting is that his style really moves away from the traditional bold line work and flat colors that we see in most comics, and instead he is really adding drama to the panels through a very painterly approach. So what I think is interesting about his work is that each cell could function as a separate art piece, which makes his work so much fun to look at. So this is from Arkham Asylum, but he's also well known for doing work for Neil Gaiman in the Sandman comics. Junji Ito, if you haven't read Uzumaki, it's pretty fantastic. But he's a manga artist who focuses primarily on body horror. And like I said, Uzumaki, it's his best known work, but the book itself focuses on spirals, which are apparently terrifying. Did you know? Yeah, he can make something so banal into something quite freaky, which is really interesting. But what's great about his style is his heavy hatching and his ink work. It's very detailed and complex, but he can go from very simple to heavily rendered work from panel to panel, which makes it very interesting. Emily Carroll is really fun because she is breaking away from that standard panel and gutter style of comics, and instead she's using color and shape to define the movement and to define kind of the way that we're reading through the story. So her work is, kind of horror fairy tale sort of style, but very fun, very great compositions in her pages as you work through it. John Jennings does this book called Blue Hand Mojo, and interesting, it's a Depression era supernatural fantasy, but what's fun is that he's using Robert Johnson, if you're not familiar, very, very famous blues guitarist from way back in the day, but this book features the cousin of Robert Johnson, so there's lots of voodoo and crazy stuff in it, but his style is very interesting. So we see kind of the halftones throughout. There's kind of an emphasis on shape over line work, whereas the lines almost act like negative space in his pieces. So it's very distinctive, really fun to look through. Another one of my favorites is David Mack. His splash pages really border on fine art with his use of mixed media throughout his pieces, the unique layouts, and the way he incorporates text. So there's so many things in this image that kind of breaks the mold of traditional comic illustration. So we see kind of this collage style, working with mixed media. There's X-Acto knives, taped all over everything. But it's almost like, how would I say, like a visual journal with speech bubbles put into it. And I think that's what makes his work really striking and different from our usual comic books. So now we move on from style to capitalism. I don't know, whatever. Or layout, I guess. So, Calvin and Hobbes, again, so good, wonderful, and more. The torment of existence weighed against the horror of non-being. I love it. Okay, back to the thread. So here in this image, we can see the bare bones sort of rough sketches in some of Gil Kane's layouts for giant-sized defenders. So when we look at these, how is he creating a dynamic composition in each cell as well as throughout the entire page? So some things you can notice here are these really strong diagonals in his compositions, especially on the left-hand page, but also he's energizing the page through a number of the smaller cells in the center as well by using this diagonal. It's kind of creating like a Y shape almost, dragging our eyes downward as we look at it. Whereas when we look at the last page on the right, it's almost sort of a zigzag going back and forth to move us down the page. We're back to Will Eisner here. So here we can see his architectural renderings again, but we can see that he's using architecture as a narrative device. So as we work through each room in the house, it's almost like it's divided into different panels through each different room, which is a really interesting way of telling a story. I think most people are familiar with Frank Miller, whether through his comics or through the movies made from his comics. But when we look at 300 here, you can kind of see how he is able to progress the narrative with minimal dialogue. So we have like the larger splash kind of setting the scene, but then through each of the smaller panels, it kind of jumps around and gives us this sense of movement and back and forth to continue telling the story. Frank Quitely's work with Pax Americana is really interesting. He's got some really fun layouts. So if we look on the left side, we see this sort of like breakdown of the imagery. It's expanding and contracting. It gives us like this play with time, and how time can feel really quick, really disorienting, but also can stretch out into longer moments, which is a really fun way of kind of showing that sequence of events. And then on the right, we're seeing kind of this repetition of an 8-panel layout. We see the figure 8 throughout the motif, or the figure 8 motif throughout the comic. It's kind of a lot of repetition here to give us a really strong sense of what he's trying to say with the story. And we go back to David Mack again. So here's another way that he's kind of showing us narrative progression in a different sense. So it's still linear, but it's laid out very differently from a traditional comic. So we can see, things almost seem to speed up as it moves towards the center. The boxes get smaller and closer together. But I think what's most interesting is on the outer edges of the panels, we see the figures are rendered with a lot more detail. There's a lot more, information given to us, and then as they progress towards the center of the images start to break down and become more and more simplified and just simple line work to just get kind of a simple point across, which I think is really interesting as well. Back to J.H. Williams. I keep repeating them, I'm sorry, but they're so much fun. So if you want to see some really fun, creative layouts, J.H. Williams is just super cool. So his work from Sandman and Promethea are especially compelling if you want to look into them. So what I think is fun with this one is the way he used sort of the bullet holes as separate cells, and they're almost, it's like it gives it a rhythm to it. So it's like you can, feel the rhythm of the piece as it's going across. You can almost hear it, which I think is really fun as he's working across the image here. And another one from J.H. Williams from Sandman. I don't know. I had to include this one because it's just so bizarre. So definitely an unconventional manner of creating panels would be to use teeth as your panel outline. So, without context, it's pretty hard to tell why this is happening. And I haven't read this particular Sandman, unfortunately. So I can't tell you. It's a mystery. All right, back to Emily Carroll. So what I think is really fun with these panels in Through the Woods is the way she uses this sort of like flat shape of the red to kind of progress our narrative. So not only does it lead our eye through the image, but it also contains our dialogue. And speaking of dialogue, verbing weirds language. It's so important today in these times. So when we're looking at comics, we want to think to ourselves, how does the artist use dialogue in the artwork? Is it the star of the show, or is it simply just context to supplement the imagery? So a lot of the stuff we've been looking at previously is more of a supplement to the visual images that we're seeing. But when we move more into graphic novels, then we're starting to focus also on the words in addition to the imagery. So the words become kind of a secondary source. So we're really like focusing on the words as well. Okay, so this strip in particular really got me through graduate school. Yes. With a little practice, writing can be an intimidating and impenetrable fog. It's true. All right. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Art Spiegelman's graphic novel Maus about the Holocaust. So, here lots of dialogue, lots of storyline throughout the image. So I feel like the writing is really evenly distributed with the imagery throughout. Daniel Clowes, if you're not familiar, he's best known for his graphic novel turned film Ghost World, and also Art School Confidential, which was derived from his comic titled 8 Ball. And basically, Art School Confidential was about his experiences at Pratt in the 80s. So pretty fun. Lots of cool art kids in it. His work was really inspired from the alternative comic scene and helped bring some legitimacy to the graphic novel medium, with Ghost World being one of the first comics to actually be marketed as a graphic novel. So really important in the history of comics and graphic novels. Alison Bechdel, also a really big name. Most of you might know her from the Bechdel test, which this comic strip is actually about. This is where it came from. So the Bechdel test is basically asking the question, when you're reading a book or watching a movie or whatever, are there at least 2 female characters? Do they speak to one another? And do they talk about something other than a man? So a lot of people tend to use that as a way of judging, new media, which is pretty fun. So, all right. Marjane Satrapi, most known for Persepolis, which is her experience in pre-revolution Iran. And her work is really interesting because she uses really heavy areas of black and white, and it's almost like a reduction print in her images, just like really flat shapes of color. But she also uses large blocks of text to advance her storyline, like many graphic novels. The 9-panel style of layout, as we see here in Watchmen, is good when there's a lot of information or dialogue to convey, because it's easier to read quickly through the panels when the layouts are a little less creative, so to speak. However, this doesn't mean that the 9-panel style is necessarily boring. So when we look at this page, note the contrasting use of warm and cool colors. And there's like this sense of disorientation created by the rapid change in point of view and color that lends itself to the sort of chaos and confusion of this fight. Here is a layout from Frank Quitely, again from Pax Americana, but he's able to tell a story just solely through his layout. So our eyes really easily follow the movement of the people going down the stairs in this sort of Z shape. The panels break up one large image of the staircase, but the point of view is just slightly different in each panel. So it breaks up the traditional left-right reading style, but we're still able to easily follow the storyline due to those strong directional forces that are present. Emile Ferris, oh, she's so great. She has a really interesting story. So in like 2000, 2001-ish, she contracted West Nile virus and became paralyzed from the waist down. And she also lost mobility in her dominant hand. So she like couldn't move her right hand. Terrifying. That's like the stuff nightmares are made out of. But she taught herself how to draw again, creating this 400-page graphic novel called My Favorite Thing is Monsters. It's crazy. Like, you need to check out this book. It's phenomenal. But the entire book is as if we're looking through a notebook, and it's all drawn with ballpoint pen. So really dynamic, really great mark making, and also a really interesting story. She's trying to solve a murder. It's really suspenseful and dramatic, but there's also monsters. All right, my last slide is from Promethea. It was J.H. Williams again. So in the instance of this spread, the artwork appears to take precedence over clarity. So we see the rotating of the speech bubbles kind of move with the change of gravity, and it causes the viewer to rotate the page in order to read the dialogue. So really interactive, super fun. All right, so that's what I have for sequential art. Honestly, I could talk about this forever because there's so many cool things, but I don't want to just take all of your time. But I hope you enjoyed it, and let's talk a little bit about your project. All right, so we've got our final project, sequential art here. So basically what I'm asking you to do is to use the original character that you developed in your last project, or conversely, whatever you want. But, some of you need that, reason to make a character. So you're going to create roughly a 12 by 18 spread of a sequential artwork. So some kind of narrative progression. It can literally be about anything. I do not care. You could divide this into 2 9 by 12 sheets. Basically just work with what you have. If you are not able to get, a 12 by 18 sheet of paper, I'm not going to fault you for that. So just work with what you have. If you want to do more, by all means, go for it. I will never stop someone from going above and beyond. So basically, using your character, you could develop a convincing plot that your character might be involved in. Just think of some part of that plot that you would want to turn into a page. Otherwise, you could maybe even focus on current events. So you could create a narrative about quarantine or daily life or, whatever's going on in your world. I am totally open to however you want to approach this. So basically, I want you to begin storyboarding. How are you getting from A to B? So what needs to happen to tell your story, to advance your plot? So just kind of plan out any ideas in a sequence, and that rough storyboard plan will be for our preliminary critique, which is Monday, April 27th. And then you can start developing a layout for your cells. So what kind of composition is going to advance your narrative? Do you want it to focus more on imagery or focus more on dialogue? Those things will kind of help you figure out what kind of layout you want to work with. And then for your final, just think about like what media that you have will work best to enhance your design and make it your own. So your final critique is Wednesday, May 6th, and then your project is due Monday, May 11th. So again, if you have any questions, you can email me, or there's a little discussion box in D2L in the Sequential Art folder. You can ask questions for everyone to see if you want. So that's all I have for you. Good luck.